The Sinking of the Titanic and Other Great Sea Disasters, edited by Logan Marshall. Chapter 10. On Board the Carpathia. Aid for the Suffering and Hysterical. Burying the Dead. Vote of thanks to Captain Rostron of the Carpathia. Identifying those saved. Communicating with land. The passage to New York. If the scenes in the lifeboats were tear-bringing, hardly less so was the arrival of the boats at the Carpathia with their bands of terror-stricken, grief-ridden survivors, many of them too exhausted to know that safety was at hand. Watchers on the Carpathia were moved to tears. The first lifeboat reached the Carpathia about 5:30 in the morning, recorded one of the passengers on the Carpathia, and the last of the 16 boats was unloaded before 9 o'clock. Some of the lifeboats were only half filled, the first one having but 2 men and 11 women, when it had accommodations for at least 40. There were few men in the boats. The women were the gamest lot I had ever seen. Some of the men and women were in evening clothes, and others among those saved had nothing on but night clothes and raincoats. After the Carpathia had made certain that there was no more passengers of the Titanic to be picked up, she threaded her way out of the ice fields for 50 miles. It was dangerous work, but it was managed without trouble. Aid for the suffering and hysterical. The shrieks and cries of the women and men picked up in the lifeboats by the Carpathia were horrible. The women were clothed only in night robes and wrappers. The men were in their night garments. One was lifted on board entirely nude. All the passengers who could bear nourishment were taken into the dining rooms and cabins by Captain Rostron and given food and stimulants. Passengers of the Carpathia gave up their berths and staterooms to the survivors. As soon as they were landed on the Carpathia, many of the women became hysterical, but on the whole they behaved splendidly. Men and women appeared to be stunned all day Monday, the full force of the disaster not reaching them until Tuesday night. After being wrapped up in blankets and filled with brandy and hot coffee, the first thoughts were for their husbands and those at home. Most of them imagined that their husbands had been picked up by other vessels, and they began flooding the wireless rooms with messages. It was almost certain that those who were not on board the Carpathia had gone down to death. One of the most seriously injured was a woman who had lost both her children. Her limbs had been severely torn, but she was very patient. Women seeking news. In the first cabin library, women of wealth and refinement mingled their grief and asked eagerly for news of the possible arrival of a belated boat, or a message from other steamers telling the safety of their husbands. Mrs. Henry B. Harris, wife of a New York theatrical manager, checked her tears long enough to beg that some message of hope be sent to her father-in-law. Mrs. G. Thorne, Miss Marie Young, Mrs. Emile Tassig, and her daughter, Ruth, Mrs. Martin Rothschild, Mrs. William Augustus Spencer, Mrs. J. Stewart White, and Mrs. Walter M. Clark were a few of those who lay back, exhausted, on the leather cushions and told in shuddering sentences of their experiences. Mrs. John Jacob Astor and the Countess of Rothes had been taken to staterooms soon after their arrival on shipboard. Before noon, at the captain's request, the first cabin passengers of the Titanic gathered in the saloon and the passengers of other classes in corresponding places on the rescue ship. Then the collecting of the names was begun by the purser and the stewards. A second table was served in both cabins for the new guests, and the Carpathia's second cabin, being better filled than its first, the second-class arrivals had to be sent to steerage. Tears their only relief. Mrs. Jacques Futrelle, wife of the novelist, herself a writer of note, sat dried-eyed in the saloon, telling her friends that she had given up hope for her husband. She joined with the rest in inquiries as to the chances of rescue by another ship, and no one told her what soon came to be the fixed opinion of the men, that all those saved were on the Carpathia. "I feel better," Mrs. Futrelle said hours afterward, "for now I can cry." Among the men conversation centered on the accident and the responsibility for it. Many expressed the belief that the Titanic, in common with other vessels, had had warning of the ice packs, but that in the effort to establish a record on the maiden run, sufficient heed had not been paid to the warnings. "God knows I'm not proud to be here," said a rich New York man. "I got on a boat when they were about to lower it, and when, from delays below, there was no woman to take the vacant place. I don't think any man who was saved is deserving of censure, but I realize that, in contrast with those who went down, we may be viewed unfavorably." He showed a picture of his baby boy as he spoke. Pitiful scenes of grief. As the day passed, the fore part of the ship assumed some degree of order and comfort, but the crowded second cabin and rear decks gave forth the incessant sound of lamentation. A bride of 2 months sat on the floor and moaned her widowhood. An Italian mother shrieked the name of her lost son. A girl of 7 wept over the loss of her teddy bear and 2 dolls, while her mother, with streaming eyes, dared not tell the child that her father was lost too, and that the money for which their home in England had been sold had gone down with him. Other children clung to the necks of the fathers who, because carrying them, had been permitted to take the boats. In the hospital and public rooms lay, in blankets, several others who had been benumbed by the water. Mrs. Rosa Abbott, who was in the water for hours, was restored during the day. K. Whiteman, the Titanic's barber, who declared he was blown off the ship by the second of the 2 explosions after the crash, was treated for bruises. A passenger who was thoroughly ducked before being picked up caused much amusement on this ship, soon after the doctors were through with him, by demanding a bath. Survivors aid the destitute. Storekeeper Prentice, the last man off the Titanic to reach the ship, was also soon over the effects of his long swim in the icy waters into which he leaped from the poop deck. The physicians of the Carpathia were praised, as was Chief Steward Hughes, for work done in making the arrivals comfortable and averting serious illness. Monday night on the Carpathia was one of rest. The wailing and sobbing of the day were hushed as widows and orphans slept. Tuesday, save for the crowded condition of the ship, matters took somewhat their normal appearance. The second cabin dining room had been turned into a hospital to care for the injured, and the first, second, and third class dining rooms were used for sleeping rooms at night for women, while the smoking rooms were set aside for men. All available space was used, some sleeping in chairs and some on the floor, while a few found rest in the bathrooms. Every cabin had been filled, and women and children were sleeping on the floors in the dining saloon, library, and smoking rooms. The passengers of the Carpathia had divided their clothes with the shipwrecked ones until they had at least kept warm. It is true that many women had to appear on deck in kimonos, and some in underclothes with a coat thrown over them, but their lives had been spared and they were not thought of dress. Some children in the second cabin were entirely without clothes, but the women had joined together with needles and thread they could pick up from passenger to passenger, and had made warm clothes out of the blankets belonging to the Carpathia. Women befriended one another. The women aboard the Carpathia did what they could by word and act to relieve the sufferings of the rescued. Most of the survivors were in great need of clothing, and this the women of the Carpathia supplied to them as long as their surplus stock held out. J. A. Shuttleworth of Louisville, Kentucky, befriended Mrs. Lucien Smith, whose husband went down with the Titanic. Mrs. Smith was formerly Miss Eloise Hughes, daughter of Representative and Mrs. James A. Hughes of Huntington, West Virginia, and was on her wedding trip. Mr. Shuttleworth asked her if there wasn't something he could do for her. She said that all the money she had was lost on the Titanic, so Mr. Shuttleworth gave her $500. Deaths on the Carpathia. 2 of the rescued from the Titanic died from shock and exposure before they reached the Carpathia, and another died a few minutes after being taken on board. The dead were W. H. Hoyt, first cabin, Abraham Hormer, third class, and S. C. Sarabert, steward, and they were buried at sea the morning of April 15th, latitude 41.14 north, longitude 51.24 west. P. Lyon, able seaman, died and was buried at sea the following morning. An assistant steward lost his mind upon seeing one of the Titanic's rescued firemen expire after being lifted to the deck of the Carpathia. An Episcopal bishop and a Catholic priest from Montreal read services of their respective churches over the dead. The bodies were sewed up in sacks, heavily weighted at the feet, and taken to an opening in the side of the ship on the lower deck not far above the waterline. A long plank tilted at one end served as the incline down which the weighted sacks slid into the sea. "After we got the Titanic's passengers on board our ship," said one of the Carpathia's officers, "it was a question as to where we should take them. Some said the Olympic would come out and meet us and take them on to New York, but others said they would die if they had to be lowered again into small boats to be taken up by another. So we finally turned toward New York, delaying the Carpathia's passengers 8 days in reaching the Gibraltar." Survivors watch new boats. There were several children on board who had lost their parents. One baby of 11 months with a nurse who, coming on board the Carpathia with the first boat, watched with eagerness and sorrow for each incoming boat, but to no avail. The parents had gone down. There was a woman in the second cabin who lost 7 children out of 10, and there were many other losses quite as horrible. Mr. Ismay, pitiable sight. Among the rescued ones who came on board the Carpathia was the president of the White Star Line. "Mr. Ismay reached the Carpathia in about the 10th lifeboat," said an officer. "I didn't know who he was, but afterward heard the others of the crew discussing his desire to get something to eat the minute he put his foot on deck. The steward who waited on him, Maguire from London, says Mr. Ismay came dashing into the dining room and throwing himself into a chair said, 'Hurry for God's sake and get me something to eat. I'm starved. I don't care what it costs or what it is. Bring it to me.' Maguire brought Mr. Ismay a load of stuff, and when he had finished it, he handed Maguire a $2 bill. 'Your money is no good on this ship,' Maguire told him. 'Take it,' insisted Mr. Ismay, shoving the bill in Maguire's hand. 'I am well able to afford it. I will see to it that the boys of the Carpathia are well rewarded for this night's work.' This promise started Maguire making inquiries as to the identity of the man he had waited on. Then we learned he was Mr. Ismay. I did not see Mr. Ismay after the first few hours. He must have kept to his cabin. A passenger on the Carpathia said there was no wonder that none of the wireless telegrams addressed to Mr. Ismay were answered until the one that he sent yesterday afternoon to his line, the White Star. "Mr. Ismay was beside himself," said this woman passenger, "and on most of the voyage after we had picked him up, he was being quieted with opiates on orders of the ship's doctor." 5 dogs and 1 pig saved. 5 women saved their pet dogs, carrying them in their arms. Another woman saved a little pig, which she said was her mascot. Though her husband is an Englishman and she lives in England, she is an American and was on her way to visit her folks here. How she cared for the pig aboard ship, I do not know, but she carried it up the side of the ship in a big bag. I did not mind the dog so much, but it seemed to me to be too much when a pig was saved and human beings went to death. It was not until noon on Monday that we cleared the last of the ice, and Monday night a dense fog came up and continued until the following morning. Then a strong wind, a heavy sea, a thunderstorm, and a dense fog Tuesday night caused some of the uneasiness among the more unnerved, the fog continuing all of Tuesday. A number of whales were sighted as the Carpathia was clearing the last of the ice, one large one being close by, and all were spouting like geysers. Vote of thanks to the Carpathia. On Tuesday afternoon, a meeting of the uninjured survivors was called in the main saloon for the purpose of devising means of assisting the more unfortunate, many of whom had lost relatives and all their personal belongings, and thanking divine providence for their deliverance. The meeting was called to order, and Mr. Samuel Goldenberg was elected chairman. Resolutions were then passed, thanking the officers, surgeons, passengers, and crew of the Carpathia for their splendid services in aiding the rescued, and like resolutions for the admirable work done by the officers, surgeons, and crew of the Titanic. A committee was then appointed to raise funds on board the Carpathia to relieve the immediate wants of the destitute and assist them in reaching their destinations, and also to present a loving cup to the officers of the Carpathia, and also a loving cup to the surviving officers of the Titanic. Mr. T. J. Frauenthal of New York was made chairman of the committee of subscriptions. A committee consisting of Mrs. J. J. Brown, Mrs. William Bucknell, and Mrs. George Stone was appointed to look after the destitute. There was a subscription taken up, and up to Wednesday the amount contributed totaled $15,000. The work of the crew on board the Carpathia in rescuing the most noble and remarkable, and these 4 days that the ship has been overcrowded with its 710 extra passengers, could not have been better handled. The stewards have worked with undying strength, although one was overcome with so much work and died and was put to his grave at sea. I have never seen or felt the benefits of such royal treatment. I have heard the captain criticized because he did not answer telegrams, but all that I can say is that he showed us every possible courtesy, and if we had been on our own boats, having paid our fares there, we could not have had better food or better accommodations. Men who had paid for the best staterooms on the Carpathia left their rooms so that we might have them. They fixed up beds in the smoking rooms and mattresses everywhere. All the women who were rescued were given the best staterooms, which were surrendered by the regular passengers. None of the regular passengers grumbled because their trip to Europe was interrupted, nor did they complain that they were put to the inconvenience of receiving hundreds of strangers. The women on board the Carpathia were particularly kind. It shows that for every cruelty of nature there is a kindness. For every misfortune there is some goodness. The men and women took up collections on board for the rescued steerage passengers. Mrs. Astor, I believe, contributed $2,000, her check being cashed by the Carpathia. Altogether, something like $15,000 was collected, and all the women were provided with sufficient money to reach their destination after they were landed in New York. Under any other circumstances, the suffering would have been intolerable, but the good Samaritans on the Carpathia gave many women heart's ease. The spectacle on board the Carpathia on the return trip to New York at times was heartrending, while at other times those on board were quite cheerful. Chapter 11. Preparations on land to receive the sufferers. Police arrangements, donations of money and supplies, hospitals and ambulances made ready, private houses thrown open, waiting for the Carpathia to arrive. The ship sighted. New York City, touched to the heart by the great ocean calamity and desiring to do what it could to lighten the woes and relieve the sufferings of the pitiful little band of men and women rescued from the Titanic, opened both its heart and its purse. The most careful and systematic plans were made for the reception and transfer to homes, hotels, or institutions of the Titanic survivors. Mayor Gaynor, with Police Commissioner Waldo, arranged to go down the bay on the police boat patrol to come up with the Carpathia and take charge of the police arrangements at the pier. In anticipation of the enormous number that would, for a variety of reasons, credible or otherwise, surge about the Cunard Pier at the coming of the Carpathia, Mayor Gaynor and the police commissioner had seen to it that the streets should be rigidly sentineled by continuous lines of policemen under Inspector George McCluskey, the man of most experience, perhaps, in handling large crowds. There were 200 men, including 12 mounted men, and a number in citizens' clothes. For 2 blocks to the north, south, and east of the dock lines were established through which none save those bearing passes from the government and the Cunard line could penetrate. With all arrangements made that experience or information could suggest, the authorities settled down to await the docking of the Carpathia. No word had come to either the White Star Line or the Cunard Line, they said, that any of the Titanic's people had died on that ship, or that bodies had been recovered from the sea. But in the afternoon Mayor Gaynor sent word to the Board of Coroners that it might be well for some of that body to meet the incoming ship. Coroners Feinberg and Holzhauser, with coroner's physician Weston, arranged to go down the bay on the patrol, while Coroner Hallenstein waited at the pier. An undertaker was notified to be ready if needed. Fortunately, there was no such need. Every possible measure thought of. Every possible measure of relief for the survivors that could be thought of by officials of the city, of the federal government, by the heads of hospitals and the Red Cross and Relief Societies was arranged for. The municipal lodging house, which has accommodations for 700 persons, agreed to throw open its doors and furnish lodging and food to any of the survivors as long as they should need it. Commissioner of Charities Drummond did not know, of course, just how great the call would be for the services of his department. He went to the Cunard Pier to direct his part of the work in person. Meanwhile, he had 20 ambulances ready for instant movement on the city's pier at the foot of East 26th Street. They were ready to take patients of the reception hospital connected with Bellevue or the Metropolitan Hospital on Blackwell's Island. Ambulances from the Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn were also there to do their share. All the other hospitals in that city stood ready to take the Titanic's people and those that had ambulances promised to send them. The Charities ferry boat, Thomas S. Brennan, equipped as a hospital craft, lay off the department pier with nurses and physicians ready to be called to the Cunard Pier on the other side of the city. St. Vincent's Hospital had 120 beds ready, New York Hospital 12, Bellevue and the Reception Hospital 120, and Flower Hospital 12. The House of Shelter maintained by the Hebrew Sheltering and Immigrant Aid Society announced that it was able to care for at least 50 persons as long as might be necessary. The German Society of New York, the Irish Immigrant Society, the Italian Society, the Swedish Immigrant Society, and the Young Men's Christian Association were among the organizations that also offered to see that no needy survivor would go without shelter. Mrs. W. A. Bastide, whose husband is a member of the staff of St. Luke's Hospital, offered to the White Star Line the use of the newly opened ward at St. Luke's, which will accommodate from 30 to 60 persons. She said the hospital would send 4 ambulances with nurses and doctors, and that she had collected clothing enough for 50 persons. The line accepted her offer and said that the hospital would be kept informed as to what was needed. A trustee of Bellevue also called at the White Star offices to offer ambulances. He said that 5 or 6, with 2 or 3 doctors and nurses on each, would be sent to the pier if required. Many other hospitals, as well as individuals, called at the mayor's office, expressing willingness to take in anybody that should be sent to them. A woman living in 50th Street, just off Fifth Avenue, wished to put her home at the disposal of the survivors. D. H. Knott of 102 Waverly Place told the mayor he could take care of 100 and give them both food and lodging at the Arlington, Holly and Earl hotels. Commissioner Drummond visited the city hall and arranged with the mayor the plans for the relief to be extended directly by the city. Mr. Drummond said that the omnibuses would be provided to transfer passengers from the ship to the municipal lodging house. Mrs. Vanderbilt's efforts. Mrs. W. K. Vanderbilt, Jr. spent the day telephoning to her friends, asking them to let their automobiles be used to meet the Carpathia and take away those who needed surgical care. It was announced that as a result of Mrs. Vanderbilt's efforts, 100 limousine automobiles and all the Fifth Avenue and Riverside Drive automobile buses would be at the Cunard Pier. Immigration Commissioner Williams said that he would be at the pier when the Carpathia came in. There was to be no inspection of immigrants at Ellis Island. Instead, the commissioner sent 7 or 8 inspectors to the pier to do their work there, and he asked them to do it with the greatest possible speed and the least possible bother to the shipwrecked aliens. The immigrants who had no friends to meet them were to be provided for until their cases could be disposed of. Mr. Williams thought that some of them who had lost everything might have to be sent back to their homes. Those who were to be admitted to the United States were to be cared for by the Women's Relief Committee. Red Cross Relief. Robert W. D. Forrest, chairman of the Red Cross Relief Committee of the Charity Organization Society, after conferring with Mayor Gaynor, said that in addition to an arrangement that all funds received by the mayor should be paid to Jacob H. Schiff, the New York treasurer of the American Red Cross, the committee had decided that it could turn over all the immediate relief work to the Women's Relief Committee. The Red Cross Committee announced that careful plans had been made to provide for every possible emergency. The Emergency Committee received a telegram that Ernest P. Bicknell, director of the American Red Cross, was coming from Washington. The Red Cross Emergency Relief Committee was to have several representatives at the pier to look out for the passengers on the Carpathia. Mr. Persons and Dr. Devine were to be there, and it was planned to have others. The Salvation Army offered, through the mayor's office, accommodation for 30 single men at the Industrial Home, 533 West 48th Street, and for 20 others at its hotel, 18 Chatham Square. The Army's training school at 124 West 14th Street was ready to take 20 or 30 survivors. R. H. Farley, head of the White Star Line's third-class department, said that the line would give all the steerage passengers railroad tickets to their destination. Mayor Gaynor estimated that more than 5,000 persons could be accommodated in quarters offered through his orders. Most of these offers, of course, would have to be rejected. The mayor also said that Colonel Conley of the 69th Regiment offered to turn out his regiment to police the pier, but it was thought that such service would be unnecessary. Crowds at the docks. Long before dark on Thursday night, a few people passed the police lines and with a yellow card were allowed to go on the dock. But reports had been published that the Carpathia would not be in till midnight, and by 8 o'clock there were not more than 200 people on the pier. In the next hour, the crowd with passes tripled in number. By 9 o'clock, the pier held half as many as it could comfortably contain. The early crowd did not contain many women relatives of the survivors. Few nervous people could be seen, but here and there was a woman, usually supported by 2 male escorts, weeping softly to herself. On the whole, it was a frantic, grief-crazed crowd. Laborers rubbed shoulders with millionaires. The relatives of the rich had taxicabs waiting outside the docks. The relatives of the poor went there on foot in the rain, ready to take their loved ones. A special train was awaiting Mrs. Charles M. Hayes, widow of the president of the Grand Trunk Railroad. A private car also waited Mrs. George D. Widener. Early arrivals at the pier. Among the first to arrive at the pier was a committee from the Stock Exchange, headed by R. H. Thomas, and composed of Charles Knobloch, B. M. W. Baruch, Charles Holzderber, and J. Carlyle. Mr. Thomas carried a long black box which contained $5,000 in small bills, which was to be handed out to the needy steerage survivors of the Titanic as they disembarked. With the early arrivals at the pier were the relatives of Frederick White, who was not reported among the survivors, though Mrs. White was, Harry Mock, who came to look for a brother and sister, and Vincent Astor, who arrived in a limousine with William A. Dobbin, Colonel Astor's secretary, and 2 doctors. The limousine was kept waiting outside to take Mrs. Astor to the Astor home on Fifth Avenue. 8 limousine cars. The Waldorf Astoria had sent over 8 limousine cars to convey to the hotel these survivors: Mrs. Mark Fortune and 3 daughters, Mrs. Lucien P. Smith, Mrs. J. Stewart White, Mrs. Thornton Davidson, Mrs. George C. Douglas, Mrs. George D. Widener and maid, Mrs. George Wick, Miss Bonnell, Miss E. Ryerson, Mrs. Susan P. Ryerson, Mrs. Arthur Ryerson, Miss Mary Wick, the Mrs. Howell, Mrs. John P. Snyder, and Mr. and Mrs. D. H. Bishop. 35 ambulances at the pier. At one time, there were 35 ambulances drawn up outside the Cunard Pier. Every hospital in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx was represented. Several of the ambulances came from as far north as the Lebanon Hospital in the Bronx and the Brooklyn Hospital in Brooklyn. Accompanying them were 70 interns and surgeons from the staff of hospitals and more than 125 male and female nurses. St. Vincent's sent the greatest number of ambulances, at one time 8 of them from this hospital being in line at the pier. Miss Eva Booth, direct head of the Salvation Army, was at the pier, accompanied by Miss Elizabeth Nye and a corps of her officers, ready to aid as much as possible. The Sheltering Society and various other similar organizations also were represented, all ready to take care of those who needed them. An officer of the 69th Regiment, NGNY, offered the White Star Line officials the use of the regiment's armory for any of the survivors. Mrs. Thomas Hughes, Mrs. Auguste Belmont, and Messrs. Lavelle and McMahon of St. Patrick's Cathedral, together with a score of black-robed Sisters of Charity representing the Association of Catholic Churches, were on the pier long before the Carpathia was made fast, and worked industriously in aiding the injured and the ill. The Reverend Dr. William Carter, pastor of the Madison Avenue Reformed Church, was one of those at the pier with a private ambulance awaiting Miss Sylvia Caldwell, one of the survivors, who is known in church circles as a mission worker in foreign fields. Free railroad transportation. The Pennsylvania Railroad sent representatives to the pier, who said that the railroad had a special train of 9 cars in which it would carry free any passenger who wanted to go immediately to Philadelphia or points west. The Pennsylvania also had 8 taxicabs at the pier for conveyance of the rescue to the Pennsylvania station in 33rd Street. Among those who later arrived at the pier before the Carpathia docked were P.A.B. Widener of Philadelphia, 2 women relatives of J.B. Thayer, William Harris, Jr., the theatrical man, who was accompanied by Dr. Dinkinspill, and Henry Arthur Jones, the playwright. Relatives of saved and lost. Commander Booth of the Salvation Army was there especially to meet Mrs. Elizabeth Nye and Mrs. Rogers Abbott, both Titanic survivors. Mrs. Abbott's 2 sons were supposed to be among the lost. Miss Booth had received a cablegram from London saying that other Salvation Army people were on the Titanic. She was eager to get news of them. Also on the pier was Major Blanton, USA, stationed at Washington, who was waiting for tidings of Major Butt, supposedly at the insistence of President Taft. Senator William A. Clark and Mrs. Clark were also in the company. Dr. John R. McKenty was waiting for Mr. and Mrs. Henry S. Harper. Ferdinand W. Roebling and Carl G. Roebling, cousins of Washington A. Roebling, Jr., whose name is among the list of dead, went to the pier to see what they could learn of his fate. J.P. Morgan, Jr. arrived at the pier about half an hour before the Carpathia docked. He said he had many friends on the Titanic and was eagerly awaiting news of them all. Fire Commissioner Johnson was there with John Peel of Atlanta, Georgia, a brother of Mrs. Jacques Futrelle. Mrs. Futrelle has a son 12 years old in Atlanta and a daughter, Virginia, who has been in school in the North and is at present with friends in this city, ignorant of her father's death. A man in hysterics. There was one man in that sad waiting company who startled those near him about 9 o'clock by dancing across the pier and back. He seemed to be laughing, but when he was stopped, it was found that he was sobbing. He said that he had a relative on the Titanic and had lost control of his nerves. H. Brunt of Chicago was at the gangplank waiting for A. Salafield, head of the wholesale drug firm of Sparks, White and Company of London, who was coming to this country on the Titanic on a business trip, and whose life was saved. Waiting for the Carpathia. During the afternoon and evening tugboats, motorboats, and even sailing craft had been waiting off the Ambrose Light for the appearance of the Carpathia. Some of the waiting craft contained friends and anxious relatives of the survivors and those reported as missing. The sea was rough and choppy, and a strong east wind was blowing. There was a light fog, so that it was possible to see at a distance of only a few hundred yards. This lifted later in the evening. First to discover the incoming liner with her pitiful cargo was one of the tugboats. From out of the mist there loomed far out at the sea the incoming steamer. Rescue boat sighted. "Liner ahead!" cried the lookout on the tug to the captain. "She must be the Carpathia," said the captain, and then he turned the nose of his boat toward the spot on the horizon. Then the huge black hull and one smokestack could be distinguished. "It is the Carpathia," said the captain. "I can tell her by the stack." The announcement sent a thrill through those who had heard it. Here, at the gate of New York, was a ship whose record for bravery and heroic work would be a familiar name in history. Chapter 12. The Tragic Homecoming. The Carpathia reaches New York. An intense and dramatic moment. Hysterical reunions and crushing disappointments at the dock. Caring for the sufferers. Final realization that all hope for others is futile. List of survivors. Roll of the dead. It was a solemn moment when the Carpathia heaved in sight. There she rested on the water, a blur of black, huge, mysterious, awe-inspiring, and yet withal a thing to send thrills of pity and then of admiration through the beholder. It was a few minutes after 7 o'clock when she arrived at the entrance to Ambrose Channel. She was coming fast, steaming at better than 15 knots an hour, and she was sighted long before she was expected. Except for the usual side and masthead lights, she was almost dark, only the upper cabins showing a glimmer here and there. Then began a period of waiting, the suspense of which proved almost too much for the hundreds gathered there to greet friends and relatives, or to learn with certainty at last that those for whom they watched would never come ashore. There was almost complete silence on the pier. Doctors and nurses, members of the Women's Relief Committee, city and government officials, as well as officials of the line, moved nervously about. Seated where they had been assigned beneath the big customs letters corresponding to the initials of the names of the survivors they came to meet, sat the mass of 2,000 on the pier. Women wept, but they wept quietly, not hysterically, and the sound of the sobs made many times less noise than the hum and bustle which is usual on the pier among those awaiting an incoming liner. Slowly and majestically the ship slid through the water, still bearing the details of that secret of what happened and who perished when the Titanic met her fate. Convoying the Carpathia was a fleet of tugs bearing men and women anxious to learn the latest news. The Cunarder had been as silent for days as though it, too, were a ship of the dead. A list of survivors had been given out from its wireless station, and that was all. Even the approximate time of its arrival had been kept a secret. Nearing port. There was no response to the hail from one tug, and as others closed in, the steamship quickened her speed a little and left them behind as she swung up the channel. There was an exploding of flashlights from some of the tugs, answered seemingly by sharp stabs of lightning in the northwest, that served to accentuate the silence and absence of light aboard the rescue ship. 5 or 6 persons, apparently members of the crew or the ship's officers, were seen along the rail, but otherwise the boat appeared to be deserted. Off quarantine, the Carpathia slowed down and, hailing the immigration inspection boat, asked if the health officer wished to board. She was told that he did, and came to a stop while Dr. O'Connell and 2 assistants climbed on board. Again, the newspaper men asked for some word of the catastrophe to the Titanic, but there was no answer, and the Carpathia continued toward her pier. As she passed the revenue cutter Mohawk and the derelict destroyer Seneca, anchored off Tompkinsville, the wireless on the government vessels was seen to flash, but there was no answering spark from the Carpathia. Entering the North River, she laid her course close to the New Jersey side in order to have room to swing into her pier. By this time, the rails were lined with men and women. They were very silent. There were a few requests for news from those on board, and a few answers to questions shouted from the tugs. The liner began to slacken her speed, and the tugboat soon went alongside. Up above the inky blackness of the hull, figures could be made out, leaning over the port railing, as though peering eagerly at the little craft which was bearing down on the Carpathia. Some of them, perhaps, had passed through that inferno of the deep sea which sprang up to destroy the mightiest steamship afloat. "Carpathia, ahoy!" was shouted through a megaphone. There was an interval of a few seconds, and then, "Aye, aye," came the reply. "Is there any assistance that can be rendered?" was the next question. "Thank you, no," was the answer in a tone that carried emotion with it. Meantime, the tugboat was getting nearer and nearer to the Carpathia, and soon the faces of those leaning over the railing could be distinguished. Talk with survivors. More faces appeared, and still more. A woman who called to a man on the tugboat was asked, "Are you one of the Titanic survivors?" "Yes," said the voice, hesitatingly. "Do you need help?" "No," after a pause. "If there is anything you want done, it will be attended to." "Thank you. I have been informed that my relatives will meet me at the pier." "Is it true that some of the lifeboats sank with the Titanic?" "Yes, there was some trouble in manning them. They were not far enough away from her." All of this questioning and receiving replies was carried on with the greatest difficulty. The pounding of the liner's engines, the washing of the sea, the tugboat's engines, made it hard to understand the woman's replies. All cared for on board. "Were the women properly cared for after the crash?" she was asked. "Oh, yes," came the shrill reply. "The men were brave, very brave." Here her voice broke, and she turned and left the railing, to reappear a few moments later and cry, "Please report me as saved." "What name?" was asked. She shouted a name that could not be understood, and, apparently believing that it had been, turned away again and disappeared. "Nearly all of us are very ill," cried another woman. Here several other tugboats appeared, and those standing at the railing were besieged with questions. "Did the crash come on without warning?" a voice on one of the smaller boats megaphoned. "Yes," a woman answered. "Most of us had retired. We saved a few of our belongings." "How long did it take the boat to sink?" asked the voice. Titanic crew heroes. "Not long," came the reply. "The crew and the men were very brave. Oh, it is dreadful, dreadful to think of." "Is Mr. John Jacob Astor on board?" "No." "Did he remain on the Titanic after the collision?" "I do not know." Questions of this kind were showered at the few survivors who stood at the railing, but they seemed too confused to answer them intelligibly, and after replying evasively to some, they would disappear. Rushes onto dock. "Are you going to anchor for the night?" Captain Rostron was asked by megaphone as his boat approached Ambrose Light. It was then raining heavily. "No," came the reply. "I am going into port. There are sick people on board." "We tried to learn when she would dock," said Dr. Walter Kennedy, head of the big ambulance corps on the mist-shrouded pier, "and we were told it would not be before midnight, and that most probably it would not be before dawn tomorrow. The childish deception that has been practiced for days by the people who are responsible for the Titanic has been carried up to the very moment of the landing of the survivors." She proceeded past the Cunard Pier, where 2,000 persons were waiting her, and steamed to a spot opposite the White Star Piers at 21st Street. The ports in the big enclosed pier of the Cunard line were opened, and through them the waiting hundreds, almost frantic with anxiety over what the Carpathia might reveal, watched her as with nerve-destroying leisure she swung about in the river, dropping over the lifeboats of the Titanic that they might be taken to the piers of the White Star Line. The Titanic lifeboats. It was dark in the river, but the lowering away of the lifeboats could be seen from the Carpathia's pier, and a deep sigh arose from the multitude there as they caught this first glance of anything associated with the Titanic. Then the Carpathia started for her own pier. As she approached it, the ports on the north side of Pier 54 were closed that the Carpathia might land there. But through the two left open to accommodate the forward and after gangplates of the big liner, the watchers could see her looming larger and larger in the darkness, till finally she was directly alongside the pier. As the boats were towed away, the picture-taking and shouting of questions began again. John Badenoch, a buyer for Macy & Company, called down to a representative of the firm that neither Mr. nor Mrs. Isidore Straus were among the rescued on board the Carpathia. An officer of the Carpathia called down that 710 of the Titanic's passengers were on board, but refused to reply to other questions. The heavy hawsers were made fast without the customary shouting of ship's officers and pier hands. From the crowd on the pier came a long, shuddering murmur. In it were blended sighs and hundreds of whispers. The burden of it all was, "Here they come." Anxious men and women. About each gangplank a portable fence had been put in place, marking off some 50 feet of the pier, within which stood 100 or more customs officials. Next to the fence, crowded close against it, were anxious men and women, their gaze strained for a glance of the first from the ship, their mouths open to draw their breaths in spasmodic, quivering gasps, their bodies shaking with suppressed excitement which only the suspense itself was keeping in subjection. These were the husbands and wives, children, parents, sweethearts, and friends of those who had sailed upon the Titanic on its maiden voyage. They pressed to the head of the pier, marking the boats of the wrecked ship as they dangled at the side of the Carpathia, and were revealed in the sudden flashes of the photographers upon the tugs. They spoke in whispers, each group intent upon its own sad business. Newspaper writers, with pier passes showing in their hatbands, were everywhere. A sailor hurried outside the fence and disappeared, apparently on a mission for his company. There was a deep-drawn sigh as he walked away, shaking his head toward those who peered eagerly at him. Then came a man and woman of the Carpathia's own passengers, as their orderly dress showed them to be. Again, a sigh like a sob swept over the crowd, and again they turned back to the canopied gangplank. The first survivors. Several minutes passed, and then out of the first cabin gangway, tunneled by a somber awning, streamed the first survivors. A young woman, hatless, her light brown hair disordered, and the laden weight of the crushing sorrow heavy upon eyes and sensitive mouth, was in the van. She stopped perplexed, almost ready to drop with terror and exhaustion, and was caught by a customs official. "A survivor?" he questioned rapidly, and a nod of the head answering him, he demanded, "Your name?" The answer given, he started to lead her toward that section of the pier where her friends would be waiting. When she stepped from the gangplank, there was quiet on the pier. The answers of the woman could almost be heard by those 50 feet away, but as she staggered, rather than walked, toward the waiting throng outside the fence, a low wailing sound arose from the crowd. "Dorothy! Dorothy!" cried a man from the number. He broke through the double line of customs inspectors as though it was composed of wooden toys, and caught the woman to his breast. She opened her lips inarticulately, weakly raised her arms, and would have pitched forward upon her face had she not been supported. Her fair head fell weakly to one side as the man picked her up in his arms, and, with tears streaming down his face, stalked down the long avenue of the pier and down the long stairway to a waiting taxicab. The wailing of the crowd, its cadences, wild and weird, grew steadily louder and louder till they culminated in a mighty shriek which swept the whole big pier as though at the direction of some master hand. Rumors afloat. The arrival of the Carpathia was the signal for the most sensational rumors to circulate through the crowd on the pier. First, Mrs. John Jacob Astor was reported to have died at 8:06 o'clock when the Carpathia was on her way up the harbor. Captain Smith and the first engineer were reported to have shot themselves when they found that the Titanic was doomed to sink. Afterward, it was learned that Captain Smith and the engineer went down with their ship in perfect courage and coolness. Major Archibald Butt, President Taft's military aide, was said to have entered into an agreement with George D. Widener, Colonel John Jacob Astor, and Isidor Straus to kill them first and then shoot himself before the boat sank. It was said that this agreement had been carried out. Later it was shown that, like many other men on the ship, they had gone down without the exhibition of a sign of fear. Mrs. Cornell's safe. Magistrate Cornell's wife and her two sisters were among the first to leave the ship. They were met at the first cabin pier entrance by Magistrate Cornell and a party of friends. None of the three women had hats. One of those who met them was Magistrate Cornell's son. One of Mrs. Cornell's sisters was overheard to remark that it would be a dreadful thing when the ship began really to unload. The three women appeared to be in a very nervous state. Their hair was more or less disheveled. They were apparently fully dressed, save for their hats. Clothing had been supplied them in their need, and everything had been done to make them comfortable. One of the party said that the collision occurred at 9:45. Following closely the Cornell party was H.J. Allison of Montreal, who came to meet his family. One of the party, who was weeping bitterly as he left the pier, explained that the only one of the family that was rescued was the young brother. Mrs. Astor appeared. In a few minutes young Mrs. Astor, with her maid, appeared. She came down the gangplank, unassisted. She was wearing a white sweater. Vincent Astor and William Dobbin, Colonel Astor's secretary, greeted her and hurried her to a waiting limousine which contained clothing and other necessities of which it was thought she might be in need. The young woman was white-faced and silent. Nobody cared to intrude upon her thoughts. Her stepson said little to her. He did not feel like questioning her at such a time, he said. Last scene of Colonel Astor. Walter M. Clark, a nephew of the senator, said that he had seen Colonel Astor put his wife in a boat after assuring her that he would soon follow her in another. Mr. Clark and others said that Colonel and Mrs. Astor were in their suite when the crash came, and that they appeared quietly on deck a few minutes afterward. Here and there among the passengers of the Carpathia and from the survivors of the Titanic, the story was gleaned of the rescue. Nothing in life will ever approach the joy felt by the hundreds who were waiting in little boats on the spot where the Titanic floundered when the lights of the Carpathia were first distinguished. That was at 4 o'clock on Monday morning. Dr. Frauenthal welcomed. Efforts were made to learn from Dr. Henry Frauenthal something about the details of how he was rescued. Just then, or as he was leaving the pier, beaming with evident delight, he was surrounded by a big crowd of his friends. "There's Harry! There he is!" they yelled, and made a rush for him. All the doctor's face, that wasn't covered with red beard, was aglow with smiles as his friends hugged him and slapped him on the back. They rushed him off bodily through the crowd, and he, too, was whirled home. A sad story. How others followed, how heart-rending stories of partings and of thrilling rescues were poured out in an amazing stream. This has all been told over and over again in the news that for days amazed, saddened, and angered the entire world. It is the story of a disaster that nations, it is hoped, will make impossible in the years to come. In the stream of survivors were a peer of the realm, Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his secretary, side by side with plain Jack Jones of Birmingham, able seamen, millionaires and paupers, women with bags of jewels and others with nightgowns their only property. More than 70 widows. More than 70 widows were in the weeping company. The only large family that was saved in its entirety was that of the Carters of Philadelphia. Contrasting with this remarkable salvage of wealthy Pennsylvanians was the sleeping 11-month-old baby of the Allisons, whose father, mother, and sister went down to death after it, and its nurse had been placed in a lifeboat. Millionaire and pauper, titled grandee and weeping immigrant, Ismay, the head of the White Star Company, and Jack Jones from the stokehole were surrounded instantly. Some would gladly have escaped observation. Every man among the survivors acted as though it were first necessary to explain how he came to be in a lifeboat. Some of the stories smacked of Munchausen. Others were as plain and unvarnished as a pikestaff. Those that were the most sincere and trustworthy had to be fairly pulled from those who gave their sad testimony. Far into the night the recitals were made. They were told in the rooms of hotels, in the wards of hospitals, and upon trains that sped toward saddened homes. It was a symposium of horror and heroism, the like of which has not been known in the civilized world since man established his dominion over the sea. Steerage passengers. The 200 and more steerage passengers did not leave the ship until 11 o'clock. They were in a sad condition. The women were without wraps, and the few men there wore very little clothing. A poor Syrian woman, who said she was Mrs. Habush, bound for Youngstown, Ohio, carried in her arms a 6-year-old baby girl. This woman had lost her husband and 3 brothers. "I lost 4 of my menfolks," she cried. 2 little boys. Among the survivors who elicited a large measure of sympathy were 2 little French boys who were dropped, almost naked, from the deck of the sinking Titanic into a lifeboat. From what place in France did they come, and to what place in the New World were they bound? There was not one iota of information to be had as the identity of the waifs of the deep, the orphans of the Titanic. The 2 baby boys, 2 and 4 years old respectively, were in charge of Miss Margaret Hayes, who is a fluent speaker of French, and she had tried vainly to get from the lisping lips of the 2 little ones some information that would lead to the finding of their relatives. Miss Hayes, also a survivor of the Titanic, took charge of the almost naked waifs on the Carpathia. She became warmly attached to the 2 boys, who unconcernedly played about, not understanding the great tragedy that had come into their lives. The 2 little curly heads did not understand it at all. Had not their pretty 19-year-old foster mother provided them with pretty suits and little white shoes and playthings aplenty? Then, too, Miss Hayes had a palm dog that she brought with her from Paris, and which she carried in her arms when she left the Titanic, and held to her bosom throughout the long night in the lifeboat, and to which the children became warmly attached. All 3 became aliens on an alien shore. Miss Hayes, unable to learn the names of the little fellows, had dubbed the older Louis and the younger Lump. Lump was all that his name implies, for he weighed almost as much as his brother. They were dark-eyed and brown curly-haired children who knew how to smile as only French children can. On the fateful night of the Titanic disaster, and just as the last boats were pulling away with their human freight, a man rushed to the rail holding the babes under his arms. He cried to the passengers in one of the boats and held the children aloft. 3 or 4 sailors and passengers held up their arms. The father dropped the older boy. He was safely caught. Then he dropped the little fellow and saw him folded in the arms of a sailor. Then the boat pulled away. The last scene of the father, whose last living act was to save his babes, he was waving his hand in a final parting. Then the Titanic plunged to the ocean's bed. Baby Travers. Still more pitiable in one way was the lot of the baby survivor, 11 months old Travers Allison, the only member of a family of 4 to survive the wreck. His father, H.J. Allison, and mother and Lorraine, a child of 3, were victims of the catastrophe. Baby Travers, in the excitement following the crash, was separated from the rest of the family just before the Titanic went down. With the party were 2 nurses and a maid. Major Arthur Peuchen of Montreal, one of the survivors, standing near the little fellow, who, swathed in blankets, lay blinking at his nurse, described the death of Mrs. Allison. She had gone to the deck without her husband, and frantically seeking him, was directed by an officer to the other side of the ship. She failed to find Mr. Allison, and was quickly hustled into one of the collapsible lifeboats, and when last seen by Major Peuchen, she was toppling out of the half-swamped boat. J. W. Allison, a cousin of H. J. Allison, was at the pier to care for Baby Travers and his nurse. They were taken to the Manhattan Hotel. Describing the details of the perishing of the Allison family, the rescued nurse said they were all in bed when the Titanic hit the berg. "We did not get up immediately," said she, "for we had not thought of any danger. Later we were told to get up, and I hurriedly dressed the baby. We hastened up on deck, and confusion was all about. With other women and children we clambered to the lifeboats, just as a matter of precaution, believing there was no immediate danger. In about an hour there was an explosion, and the ship appeared to fall apart. We were in the lifeboat about 6 hours before we were picked up." The Ryerson family. Probably few deaths have caused more tears than Arthur Ryerson's, in view of the sad circumstances which called him home from a lengthy tour in Europe. Mr. Ryerson's eldest son, Arthur Leonard Ryerson, a Yale student, was killed in an automobile accident Easter Monday, 1912. A cablegram announcing the death plunged the Ryerson family into mourning, and they boarded the first steamship for this country. It happened to be the Titanic, and the death note came near being the cause of the blotting out of the entire family. The children who accompanied them were Miss Susan P. Ryerson, Miss Emily B. Ryerson, and John Ryerson. The latter is now 12 years old. They did not know their son intended to spend the Easter holidays at their home in Haverford, Pennsylvania, until they were informed of his death. John Lewis Hoffman, also of Haverford, and a student of Yale, was killed with young Ryerson. The two were hurrying to Pennsylvania to escort a fellow student to his train. In turning out of the road to pass a cart, the motor car crashed into a pole in front of the entrance to the estate of Mrs. B. Frank Clyde. The college men were picked up unconscious and died in the Bryn Mawr Hospital. G. Hyde Norris of Philadelphia, who went to New York to meet the surviving members of the Ryerson family, told of a happy incident at the last moment as the Carpathia swung close to the pier. There had been no positive information that young Jack Ryerson was among those saved. Indeed, it was feared that he had gone down with the Titanic like his father, Arthur Ryerson. Mr. Norris spoke of the feeling of relief that came over him as, watching from the pier, he saw Jack Ryerson come from a cabin and stand at the railing. The name of the boy was missing from some of the lists, and for 2 days it was reported he had perished.